Dave Talks Comics, Episode 44, Baltimore Comic-Con 2014, Part 2 of 3. Dave Talks Comics is a podcast usually on the subjects of comic books and cartoons. Usually, I talk about the comics I have read and the cartoons I have watched. On this episode, this will be my second installment, talking about the 2014 edition of the Baltimore Comic-Con and the day that I spent there. In this episode, I will be talking about some more comics that I bought, but before I get to that, I will be talking about the Fanzine Panel, which is about pros as in people who work in the comic industry, and how a lot of them first got their start in fanzines. In other words, their artwork published, and in some cases, some writers got some stories published there. And on the panel are a number of people who are still working, and all of whom are still working in comics. Well, one of them is a fanzine person, but it's all about them and the kind of stuff they did, and I'll get into that in the episode. After the Dave Gibbons panel, I had it ran over a little bit, so I only had about 50 minutes until the next panel I wanted to go to, which was going to be at 2 o'clock, which was the Fanzine Panel. Hold on, let me get the exact title. No, that's the wrong page. Prose, Spawns of Fanzines and Fandom. That was the title of the next panel I was going to go to. So I went back downstairs. I wandered around a little bit. I looked at various things. I looked through some publishers' stuff. I didn't buy anything on this trip down to the floor. I did look through some books that were interesting. Like I looked through the Planet of the Apes books that Gabe Hardman and Corinna Becco have done. And I recently listened to interviews with them they were both on 11 O'Clock Comics, and he was on Word Balloon? I think he was on Word Balloon also recently. So I listened to both of those very recently. And I don't think they were at this show. They live on the West Coast. That's not too surprising. So I didn't actually buy anything on this trip. I just wandered around and looked and did my best to restrain myself from buying anything. Let's see. So after I wandered around for a little bit, then I went back upstairs to the 300 level, which is where all the panels were, and I found the room where the prose, fandom, and fanzines. What was it called again? Prose, Spawns of Fanzines and Fandom. And this had a pretty big panel, a pretty big number of people up on the stage. There were 6 of them. The guy who moderated it, his name was Aaron Kaplan. And he started off by talking about the definition of a fanzine. How fanzines were normally, books written or newsletters written by fans, printed in very primitive ways quite often back in the day. How he talked about how Siegel and Schuster were among, the creators of Superman, were among those who actually started by doing fanzines. They did a story called, he showed a picture of a story they'd done called Reign of the Supermen, which ran in a fanzine. He mentioned Roy Thomas was another person who had started off doing fanzines, and I was aware of that. And I believe Roy Thomas worked on the original incarnation of Alter Ego, which ran in the 60s, although I don't think he founded it, but I'm not certain on that. And Alan Moore was another one who started by working in fanzines. Some of his first work appeared in a fanzine called Utopia, and another one called Planet Comic Collector. Jim Starlin's first work appeared in fanzines, something called Amateur Comics, and that was comics with a K, and Dr. Weird, something like that. And I'm not sure if that's a character's name or I think that might be the character's name that he drew. And also George R.R. Martin, the guy who wrote Game of Thrones. Also, his earliest work was in fanzines. A fanzine called Ymir, Y-M-I-R. I know that's a Norse name, but I'm not sure how exactly it's pronounced. And Star-Studded Comics was another one that he had stuff that appeared in. So after kind of talking about fanzines and giving us an idea of what was some of the people who had started in fanzines, he then introduced the panel. And the panel consisted of, he was sitting on the far left, and then going left to right, you had Mark Wheatley, Mark Hempel, Paul Levitz, Walt Simonson, and Ricky Shanklin. And I was familiar with all of the names except for Ricky Shanklin, although I haven't read stuff by all of them. Certainly Paul Levitz and Walt Simonson, I've read books that they've contributed to. He started with Ricky Shanklin, and Ricky has worked on books on fanzines like The Immortals and Abraxas and Alternatives. And these are all names of fanzines that he's worked on. So Aaron Kaplan, the moderator, kind of worked his way through these people talking about various things, talking about things like the slow communication. A lot of the things that he's talking about took place in like the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, when, well before the advent of email and before the internet, before the World Wide Web. So communication was very slow. Talked about how the irregular publication schedule, that you didn't even have a monthly publication with most of these fanzines. Although I think there were a few notable exceptions, but just a few. He highlighted some of the work, when he was talking to Mark Wheatley, apparently Mark Wheatley, some of his first work was in a book called Nucleus, and apparently Gary Groth, who works these days at Fantagraphics and works at the Comic Journal, was his inker on some of the first stuff that Mark Wheatley had published. So I thought that was kind of funny, especially considering the nature of the stuff, which was kind of more super heroic. And if you know anything about Gary Groth, you know that he kind of very looks down quite a bit on a lot of the superhero stuff. And I don't know, to me, I've seen him a couple times on panels at the Small Press Expo, and he seems a bit snobbish, and other places, and he seems a bit snobbish a little bit about comic books. He holds in much higher regard independent and more artsy kind of books. So he probably would not want to be reminded of something like this. Mark Wheatley also talked about some of the early attempts to get like artwork and to get the fanzines reproduced and get the artwork reproduced, and how they didn't have photocopiers at first. At first they were working with things like mimeograph machines, and how things would come out very clunky, and that the artwork really was very hard to get the artwork to come out. It was a disaster. And then he talked about how somebody hooked him up with an early photocopier, and he was working. It took him, and he didn't say exactly how many copies he made, but it would take like 3 or 4 minutes to copy. I'm not sure if it was a single page or if it was a whole fanzine. I'm thinking maybe it was even a whole page. And the machine was just extremely hot. It was putting out, excuse me, it was putting out a lot of heat. This was, I think, the 70s, the early 70s, or maybe even the late 60s. But he said that he learned a lot that has benefited him over the years through working in fanzines, about printing, about editorial, about deadlines, and so I guess it was a very formative time for him, and at least as far as his professional development goes. Next, Aaron Kaplan talked to Mark Hempel about his work, and he was very complimentary about it. And he had slides showing their work, and Mark Hempel got his first work in fanzines when he was still in high school, and his work was it looked much better than, say, Mark Wheatley's early work did. From the very beginning it looked polished. Not extremely polished, but it looked very good. It looked like he put a lot of effort into it and a lot of effort into making it look good. And some of his first work was in a book called Nucleus 9, a story called What Happened to Jordi, Jory, which I believe was a horror-type story. And I think he said it was heavily influenced by some of Bernie Wrightson's stories. And some of the other work he got early on was for the Comic Buyer Guide, doing covers for them. And he also for a fanzine called RBCC, and I'm not sure exactly what that stands for. I'm guessing CC is Comic Collector, but I'm not sure what the RB stands for. Next, Aaron Kaplan moved on to talk to Paul Levitz. And Paul Levitz, some of his early work was for Newfangles and the Comic Reader. When Newfangles stopped publishing, it led him to create his own fanzine called Etc. And let's see. And then eventually he took over the Comic Reader, which was another fanzine. And I think he said that at its height, it had a print run of about 3,500 copies, and that was in '73. And that apparently was very impressive for a fanzine, at least at that point. And he also talked about how things have changed over the years and how it's gotten to the point where it's hard to tell where the line is between small press and fanzine publishers and regular publishers, especially with all the tools that are available to individuals these days. And they had some slides there from Comic Fandom Monthly of a comic economics column that Paul Levitz did for a time, although I think he said he only did it about 4 times. So then finally, hold on. So then they were talking a little bit about, how fanzines were really, you didn't have previews back then. You didn't have any publications other than fanzines to tell you what was coming up. And even fanzines, they would get some information from I guess the guys who wrote it. And I think mostly it was guys, although there was probably a few women, but I think mostly this was a guy's thing. And the only woman that I know of off the top of my head is Kat Ironwood, who worked for fanzine type publications at that time. I'm sure there were others. But that fanzines were the only place to get any kind of advance notice. You didn't really get any, and I can remember that. When I was a kid back in the 70s, you got whatever showed up at the newsstand, or I was 10 or 11 before I saw my first comic shop. I even knew that there was such a thing as a comic shop, and I didn't even really understand the difference between a comic shop and a newsstand until I actually saw a comic shop for the first time. So they talked about things, and they made a mention of a comic book that somebody named Marv, and I'm not sure if they meant Marv Wolfman, and Pat Boyette drew, and I think it was Black Hawk, but I'm not sure. I'm going to have to investigate that. But the other thing they talked about was how, a couple of things. they mentioned how they not only had to go to newsstands, they'd go to cab stands, they'd go to tobacco shops, and so in looking for comic books, it kind of opened their eyes to different things that they otherwise wouldn't be exposed to. And that was kind of neat. And also that, I mean, as an example of the things that Marvel wouldn't talk about, Marvel was publishing magazines at the same time as they were publishing comic books. Magazines like Savage Sword of Conan, and there were some monster magazines. There was some Deadly Hands of Kung Fu, I believe, was one of the magazines they produced. But there was no cross-promotion of them, So if you only read the comic books, you wouldn't get anything about the Marvel magazines, at least not early on. And the only way that they found out about these things was by going to these other outlets and looking at the newsstands and looking at the magazine section. And they wouldn't even be, quite often, the comic magazines wouldn't even be next to the comic books. That's what they were saying. So finally, Aaron Kaplan talked to Walt Simonson. And one interesting story that I don't think I'd ever heard this before, but at one point they were showing a picture of Walt's art, a piece of art that he'd done for, I believe, for a fanzine. That makes sense. And his signature was up there. If you've ever seen his signature, it's very distinctive. And what he said was that it's always clipped off, that the editors always try to clip it because they always try to make the O in his name, Simonson, be in the middle. And that's not the way he wanted it. And apparently the story behind it is that if you see his full signature, he actually modeled it to look kind of like a dinosaur. And he said that he actually drew out like a brontosaurus and then worked until he worked it out so that his name would fit in the shape of the brontosaurus. And I thought that was really cool. And it was a story I had not heard before, and I'd heard him interviewed before. I don't know, maybe I'd heard it before, but it didn't ring any bells when I heard it. So he did some work for Locus, which at the time was a fanzine and later became a magazine. I'm not sure if it's still being published. He did some work he grew up in the D.C. area. He grew up in College Park, Maryland, although he went to RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, I believe is what that RISD is. And he did some work for some ads and covers for the Washington, the Sci-Fi Association fanzine. Gore Creature was another fanzine that he did some work for. Markings was another one. They talked a little bit about Star Slammers, which was a project that he had originally started on when he was at RISD. It had been he'd worked on it both in his junior and his senior year. He'd been able to use it as major parts of his work. And then he used it to help him get a job eventually at DC. But he didn't use the whole thing. I mean, he said his artwork improved considerably over the 2 years or more that he worked on it, and he would release like chapters. And I think he said there was a total of 8 chapters that he did. And when it came time for him to pitch it to DC, he didn't take the whole thing. He said he only took the second half, which I guess must be the last 4 chapters. And he talked about meeting. He talked about meeting Howard Chaykin and Mike Kaluta and Alan Weiss and somebody else, and I don't have that name in my notes. Maybe if I go back but that led to eventually to. I mean, he was talking to them in the cafeteria at DC Comics, and that led to him getting a meeting that day with Carmine Infantino, and Carmine liked his work so much that he instructed 3 of his editors, one of whom was Archie Goodwin, to provide Walt with backup stories. And I believe he said one of the comics that one of his first stories appeared in, the main story was by Alex Toth, and he was very happy about that because everybody would see Alex Toth. It was great that he got published, that Walt got published, but Alex Toth was on the cover, or Alex Toth was the lead, and so hopefully his stuff would get read because of that. And there was no time for questions and answers afterwards, and that's about it for my notes for the second panel that I went to. It was a very good panel. The only thing I would say is I did record it, but I'm not sure how the recording's going to come out because there was this constant whine of feedback or something coming from somewhere, not in the room, but somewhere near the room, and it was a little annoying. If I'd had a bad hearing problem, it probably would have been an issue, but so that was the Pros, Spawns of Fanzines and Fandoms panel. Well worth it. Like the Dave Gibbons panel, I thought it was awesome. And one thing I forgot about I just remembered in the Dave Gibbons panel, when they were talking about Watchmen briefly, he mentioned that somebody asked about maybe Barry Kitson, when did you know that Watchmen was good? And he said something about how after 3 issues had come out, I don't know if it was just he and Alan Moore were at the DC offices, and a bunch of the guys came out to shake their hands, and he talked specifically about how Howard Chaykin came out there and said that this is fucking A, and he was just really impressed with it, and just the way he said it, and if you've ever heard any interviews with Howard Chaykin, like on Word Balloon or on Sidebar, those are the only 2 places I can think of that he's had interviews. He's a very forthright person and a very opinionated person, and doesn't take any crap. And it sounded just like Howard Chaykin, something Howard Chaykin would say, and the way he said it, the way I'm sure he's told this story before, Dave Gibbons. But anyway, so that was it for so I'm down with 2 panels at this point. I only went to 1 more. But once again, I had a little less than an hour, so I went down to wander the floor again. This time I was not quite as successful at restraining myself from buying things. Actually, the first things I bought, I'm forgetting something. I think I bought these before that first panel, before the Dave Gibbons panel, but I can't remember exactly now. Yeah, I think I did. And these were from, I believe, Clandestine Comics. They had a bunch of boxes. They had a huge number of boxes. They were all alphabetized. I don't think they had them sorted by DC and Marvel, but they had them all. But they were all alphabetic, and they were all $1. And so I went through them, and one thing I was looking for was Hourman, because I've read the first 13 issues of Hourman, but I don't have the rest. The series only ran for 25 issues. There weren't any annuals. And I've had my eye on some, there's a couple dealers on Comic Collectors Live who have the remaining issues between them. Neither of them have all of the issues, but between them I can pick up the rest of the issues. So I was going through the boxes just in case, and guess what? They had almost all of the remaining issues, all but 1. So I was able to pick up issues 14 through 19 and 21 to 25. So all I'm missing is issue 20. Hopefully I can pick that up and online, because I wasn't able to find it later in the day anywhere else. I did look, but no luck there. So I've got the second half, basically, since I've read 1 through 13, 14 to 25 would be the last 12 issues. So I bought that, and then I continue to go through their boxes, kind of, looking around, just thinking maybe I'll find something that I'm looking for. I was looking for instance, there's a miniseries, a Hellcat miniseries. That's a Marvel comic, 3 issues done by, the art is by Norm Breyfogle, and I'm drawing a blank as to who wrote it. But I was looking for that, and I didn't find that, but what I did find a few boxes down was some Jonah Hex comics, and this is the recent series written by Jimmy Palmiotti and Justin Gray, which has artists bouncing in and out. And the first one that I found was the Darwin Cook issue, number 33. I think he's done more than 1 issue. But I found issue 33, which is drawn by Darwin Cook. And so I decided to keep looking through that. And then the next issue I found was issue 32, which was drawn by Jordi Bernet, another artist that I really like. And so I kept going through the boxes. Apparently Jordi Bernet has drawn quite a few issues of Jonah Hex. And I didn't find all of them, but I found about 7 of them, I think. So I picked up issues, let's see, issues 27, 32, 37, 54, 59, 61, and 63, all of which were drawn by Jordi Bernet and written by Justin Gray and Jimmy Palmiotti. That's interesting. I noticed some of these issues, it's Gray and then Palmiotti. In fact, a lot of them it's Gray and then Palmiotti. Yeah, there's only one of them that says Palmiotti and then Gray. Interesting. No, actually two of them. So I'm not sure what the significance of that is. So 7 issues drawn by Jordi Bernet and 1 drawn by Darwin Cook. And those were also all $1. So I spent 19 comics, $19. And I was still looking around. Let's see. Was there anything else I bought in that? Oh, yes. I had a hard time resisting anywhere. I saw dollar boxes. Now, quite often, I didn't find anything I was looking for, but at one table, whose name is escaping me at the moment. Yeah, I can't remember exactly what they were called, although I'm pretty sure I wrote it down somewhere. I picked up 7 issues of Legends of the Dark Knight. And this was that anthology series, the Batman, well, the full title is Batman, Legends of the Dark Knight. And so I found 2 stories. I didn't find the Matt Wagner story from like around issue 30 or something like that he did. I would have picked that up if they'd had it. But I did pick up a 3-parter by James Robinson and Tim Sale. And I like Tim Sale's art. I enjoyed it, his issue of Solo. I enjoyed his work on some of his work with Jeff Loeb. So I'm curious to see how this story pans out. And of course, James Robinson is, well, he's probably best known for writing Starman, which I tried. I bought the first omnibus when it first came out, and I read it, and it's like the first 16 issues or something like that. And I gotta say, I didn't hate it, but I just wasn't impressed by it, and I just wasn't moved to go on and pick up the remaining omnibuses as they came out. So, but what the piece of work of his that I really did like was DC the Golden Age or JSA? I think it's called JSA the Golden Age, which originally was an Elseworld story and now has been retconned to actually be part of continuity or something like that. But, that's just mumbo jumbo, that's just whatever, continuity. Blah. So anyway, so I bought that. That's a 3-parter. That's issues 32, 33, and 34. And this may be the story that immediately follows the Matt Wagner story. I can't remember the exact issues that's from. And then I found a 3-parter that was written by Chuck Dixon with art by Mike McMahon. And it's a very angular kind of style, Mike McMahon's work. But I like Chuck Dixon's work. So I figured I'd take a chance on it. It's not that I don't like the artwork. It's just it really stands out. It's not a clean, smooth line at all. It's heavy lines, and it's very angular. And so I'm curious to see how much I'll enjoy this. So that's another 3-parter, and that's Batman Legends of the Dark Knight, numbers 55 through 57. And then I also found annual number 7 of Batman Legends of the Dark Knight, which was written by James Robinson and illustrated by Steve Yowell and Russ Heath. And it looks like Russ Heath illustrates the middle portion of the story, which is set in the past during World War I think, or maybe it's World War II. And Steve Yowell, and I'm guessing on that pronunciation, it's spelled Yeowell, illustrates the opening and closing of the annual. So, and it looks like it's got a wartime setting. Like I said, biplane, so I assume this is World War I. So, 7 issues, $5. All I paid for that 7 issues was $5, and they're all in very nice shape. I mean, I wouldn't say mint, but, fine or something like that. So that was supposed to be the end of my buying. It was not the end of my buying. I bought a few more things, but before I bought those things, I went to the last panel of the day, and I will talk about that in the next segment of my adventures at Baltimore Comic-Con. I have just a few notes to add to what I already recorded about the second part of my day at Baltimore Comic-Con. First off, I mentioned, originally it was Walt Simonson who mentioned a couple issues of Black Hawk, and it was Black Hawk that were drawn by Pat Boyette that he really liked, and how these 2 issues came out and then there was nothing. And he said that in reference to the fact that they really couldn't tell when something was going to come out and what happened and why something was no longer coming out. And I did a little bit of research, and I found out that these issues came out in 1968. And Black Hawk was a title back then which was died and brought back and died and brought back. And the 2 issues were issues 242 and 243. I don't have the exact months that they appeared in, but it was issues 242 and 243, and after that, Black Hawk kind of went on hiatus until I think 1976, when it was brought back shortly before the DC implosion, and then it died again and was brought back later in the 1980s. But anyway, those are the 2 issues. I've added them to my wish list now. They're not extremely expensive, but they're not inexpensive. It looks like you probably pay, if you want a copy that's in decent shape, you're probably going to pay $10, $15 for it, including shipping, I'm thinking. And there's certainly copies out there for more than that. And when I say in decent shape, I mean something like in at least fine condition. There was a fanzine that was discussed during the panel that I mentioned when I was talking about it, but whose full name I didn't know, and it was referenced as RBCC, and that stands for Rockets Blast Comic Collector. It ran from 1964 to 1982. I think there was about 150 issues that came out during that time, and I'll provide, there's a Wikipedia entry for it. I'll provide a link to that on the show page, on the episode page for this episode, but I didn't find anything of particular note other than those facts that I thought are worth mentioning right now. During the story that Walt Simonson told about how he first got work at DC, I said something about him being in the cafeteria, I think, at DC Comics. It was actually a coffee room, and there was 4 people there that he was talking to, and I could only remember 3. I'd only written down 3 of the names. The 4th person was Bernie Wrightson. The others were Mike Kaluta and Howard Chaykin and Alan Weiss. And that's about it for that, as far as follow-up notes for that section. I did listen to my recording of the panel again. It is really hard to hear. I tried listening without earbuds on my computer speakers, and it was almost, I couldn't hear it at all. So I used earbuds with my iPhone, and I could hear it, but I had the sound cranked up all the way. So I'm going to provide that audio, but it's that recording. I'll put it out there on a link to it on the show page, but you really got to want to listen to this. And some of the people, especially like Paul Levitz, don't talk very loud. It makes it very hard to hear what they're saying. That's it for episode 44 of Dave Talks Comics. Dave Talks Comics can be found on the web at davetalkscomics.com. On Twitter, at Dave Talks Comics. You can email your comments or questions to dave@davetalkscomics.com. Next time on Dave Talks Comics, I will be wrapping up my coverage of the 2014 Baltimore Comic-Con. I'll be talking about the third and final panel that I went to, which is the Creator Spotlight panel for Fred Hembeck. And I'll be talking about a few more books that I bought. Thank you for listening. Baltimore Comic-Con 2014